everyone, welcome back to Bible 365. This is Kathy Carter. I'm your host, and I am bringing you the book of Proverbs. So we're in Proverbs. Bible 365 means that we are going through the Bible in 365 days. So that's 1 year of going through the Bible, reading through it chronologically, using the chronological reading plan from oneyearbibleonline.com, where you would go on, you would download the free reading plan, print it up, and read it with your Bible, or you could purchase a Bible from that company. It's in 3 different versions: NIV, New King James, and NLT. I have no affiliation with them. I just like their reading plan. It's really, really good. So that's my opener. That's it for today. We are in the book of Proverbs, which is a book written by King Solomon. Today is day 151, and it is May 30th. So we're at Proverbs 11 through 13. The Proverbs are much like exactly what it says. So even if you don't find yourself as a believer of God, or if you know nothing about God, you probably have heard of ancient Proverbs before. They're little snippets of wisdom. And this is what King Solomon has given us. The first several chapters, I don't know, I think it was like 1 through 8. He really discussed the whole idea of what it means to turn to wisdom. And he was talking to his sons. So his actual sons, which he probably had a ton of because he had a ton of wives. And so he was talking to his children and trying to give his children wisdom. His children are eventually going to rule the kingdom. At least one of them will eventually rule the kingdom. And I'm sure others will be high in leadership somewhere else. And so it's really important that they are wise in the ways of the Lord. And so I want to just dig into that a little bit, because as I said it, many people will probably think that ideal actually doesn't really matter, that it's much more important to be wise in the ways of the world, right? So like when we say wise, what do we mean? Education takes a very high, it's very high on the charts of importance in our country today. And I don't want to take anything away from that, because it does bring a lot of really good things, right? Education has brought water to countries where, there's less poverty in a lot of areas that have higher education. There's less children out of wedlock in those kind of situations, right? So I don't want to take anything away from education. I do think it's really, really important. In some ways, that's some of what he's talking about. So the purpose of being wise in some ways is to use that education in a good way, right? So wisdom is an idea of having knowledge and then using it to serve God's purposes. So being knowledgeable is great. Being knowledgeable without wisdom is useless. And so you probably can't be wise without knowledge, right? So we need to kind of understand, I don't even necessarily want to say the differences, but we need to kind of understand a little bit of what that means. And so these are in the ways of God, which is all about using your brain in ways to make the world a better place, right? Because you're following the Lord. Okay. So we learned a lot about wisdom and following wisdom, or following folly. In some ways, the adulterous woman or folly. And now he's just in these little pieces of wisdom. So again, I'm going to note that he's talking to probably his son or sons, and so probably a younger generation. And so a lot of that is what it's geared towards. And I'm going to say that and not take away from the fact that we should all be coming to this. But some of these things we need to know when we're younger in order to attain a place when we're older. Right? So some of these things we need to learn as we're growing up. And I feel like that's part of his purpose. He was giving his sons wisdom all through their young lives and their young adulthoods into adulthood. And so they could kind of go the way they're supposed to go. And then from there, it's just reminders over and over again. So hopefully some of these are reminders to you. You go, oh yeah, of course that makes sense. Or, you know what, I've fallen a little bit off of that, and now I need to go back to that. But maybe, hopefully, prayerfully with you guys, you don't have to, you're not all the way at the beginning, but in some cases that is true. So in my own case, for example, I didn't come to faith until I was in my 30s. And so not that I didn't recognize some of these things as being true and going like, oh yeah, they make sense. But for me, a lot of it was actually learning how to be wise, understanding that I had knowledge, and statistically I understood that certain things made sense, or traditionally through my family and their values, I knew that was what I wanted. But I didn't have the wisdom and the understanding about how it works in God's plan and how it's for God's desires. And so I had to relearn a lot of this wisdom because some of it didn't come naturally to me and wasn't nurtured in my life because I grew up in a house that didn't believe. All right, so I'm just going to start with some of these, and I'm saying some of this because we're going to hit some of these that you're going to think, oh well, I'm old now. It might be too late for me. Okay, so in verse 1, so we're Proverbs 11. In Proverbs 11, verse 1, it says, "The Lord detests dishonest scales, but accurate weights find favor with him." So if you're unfamiliar with this, some of this was how they weighed things in order for payment. And so they had a set of scales. And unfortunately, it was common, as it's common everywhere for people to be dishonest, unfortunately. It's common that they would weight their scales. So you would put a piece of, let's say, your jewelry on one side of the scale to see how much gold or shekels it weighed up against. And a lot of times, if they tipped the scales improperly, so if they weighted the scales already, you would come up short. And so what you thought something would be worth, they would be able to give you less money for because it was a dishonest scale. And so they understood what this meant. So for us, we don't understand it as much in the theme of things, but what we do know is we know what the value of something of what we have is. And if somebody is trying to cheat us out of the value of something that we have, right? And this can be used for more than financial, right? So this is also an idea of the way that we think about things, right? Like, have you already judged someone? I'm gonna go Christian, right? Have you already, if I'm a Protestant, have I already made a judgment on a Catholic because I already have sort of tipped the scales against what I believe from Catholicism, right? So is there already an unweighted judgment? Or if a story comes down about a certain denomination of faith, are my scales already tipped against them because I'm like, I know that healing stuff is really just, obviously I'm not talking about Catholicism anymore, like, so maybe, overt healings and things like that, and I already know that stuff is fake, right? So are my scales already tipped in the wrong direction, right? Or am I coming to this place from a fair and balanced place? And even reading the Bible, I think a lot of times we come with what we've heard for so long, and so we have a problem with a tipped balance, right? So I already come in with this idea of what I believe is true, and then when I read it, am I able to keep the scales balanced in such a way that I can see the truth for what it is, so I can judge the wisdom of it based on a proper scale versus a scale that's tipped in one direction or the other. So this is in some ways a universal statement that we can use. And so God wants us to know that coming in with a weighted scale is an unfair judgment that's made against something or someone else. And that's the purpose, right? Because they're trying to work together as Israelites, as a community. All right, I'm doing verse 2, but I'm not going to do every single one. When pride comes, then comes disgrace, but with humility comes wisdom. I've hit on this already, that pride is one of the things we actually celebrate now, and it's one of the things that God detests. So somebody that is prideful, and I'm not saying somebody who goes, I worked really hard and therefore I have pride in my work, right? I always come to work on time, so I have pride in my work. I work hard and diligently, so when I hand in whatever work I do, I'm proud of the work I did. That's not the pride in which he's talking about, although that could be tipped in the wrong direction as well, right? You can be so prideful in what you do, you can lack the recognition that God is the one who gave you the ability to do that. So pride can certainly fall in that way. But we're prideful of everything nowadays, right? Like, we're so proud that our kid is good enough to, like, my kid is a great singer. My son has a beautiful voice. And what if that's the only thing that I ever share with people, right? What if I'm so proud of it that I just over and over and over again tell everybody what an amazing voice my son has. Like, oh, my son has been blessed by the Lord and has worked really hard to have a good voice. So I could easily show that off, and I'm sure I do, by the way, but I could easily show that off, and that could be the only thing that I talk about. I'm so prideful of how good he sings. And neglecting some of the other things, or what if somebody else has a desire to sing as well? And I'm going, oh, my son is the best singer, right? Like, so we get so prideful about things. And humility is really the key. And it's not pretending that, like, I wouldn't pretend that he doesn't have a good voice, but that's not the only thing about him. And that's not the only thing that matters, right? And I can recognize that somebody else also has a beautiful voice and has really good gifts and abilities to sing really well. So it's important to maintain humility in your heart, to recognize that you're not the only one, right? Yours is a gift that has been given, right? And so it's not something that you take full credit for and that you should be standing up and so prideful about. And it's, again, in everything. So this is in every aspect of our lives, to recognize that we can be prideful about anything. And it's really something that God wants us to check. All right, so the next one is verse 4. Wealth is worthless in the day of wrath, but righteousness delivers from death. So no matter how much money you store up for yourselves, and you guys know, you hear it all the time, that everyone goes, on my deathbed, I didn't wish that I had worked one more day, right? I wish I had done something that really matters. I wish I had spent more time with friends and family. I wish I had loved better, loved more. I wish I had given more of my stuff away. I wish, right? Like, so we recognize that that's true, and yet we still want to hold on to what we consider our own, by the way, which is prideful, because we think we earned it and we deserve every penny of it, and nobody else does. And if I happen to give to somebody else, right, that somehow becomes all about me, and it doesn't become about anything else or the goodness of God. Verse 7, hopes placed in mortals die with them. All the promise of their power comes to nothing. And I wanted to point this out because in this day and age, if you guys follow any Christian podcasts or anything like that, we are in a great season of pastors that are falling. And pastors that are falling usually due to some kind of sexual indiscretion. And I don't want to point fingers and place blame, because I'm not here for that. What I can say is, quite often, as a non-pastor, as somebody in the congregation, I tended to put my power in my hopes in those people. So I would put my hopes, and then what happens if you put your hope in the person that's on stage that's telling you something, and then they sin, like we do, because we're human and we sin. So I put all my hope based on the goodness of this person, and then this person has some kind of falling out. And then what? Am I no longer a believer because that person had some personal issues, right? So we want to be careful not to put hope in people. We never want to put people on a pedestal anywhere even near God, let alone higher than God. And so this is, I believe, as all of us as believers, this is something that we need to check in ourselves all the time. Like, are you the one who's like, I can only be in a small group if it's with my pastor? I can only be in a small group if, I'm using small group as an easy one. I can only be in a small group if my leader went to seminary, right? I can only listen to somebody who has been a Christian 10 years longer than me. I can only follow the wisdom of someone who got a degree in theology, right? Otherwise, their opinion doesn't matter. We need to be very careful of saying those things. We're all put in place for a reason. We can all lift each other up. We can all offer wisdom, from the youngest to the oldest. Like, nothing is greater than watching a brand new believer become, especially like as an adult, watching a brand new believer become a believer. It's like, it's so exciting because you watch the fire in them as everything starts to make sense. And it sparks and encourages the faith in you, if only you sit back and listen. And if they have the guts to come and say, I've seen this in you, like, I shouldn't judge and get all haughty with them, like, well, I've been a believer longer than you, right? Like, they're just like everybody else. And so we've got to be careful of putting our hopes in somebody that's human and that's going to possibly sin, and then of course it's going to die. All right, verse 11. Through the blessing of the upright, a city is exalted. By the mouth of the wicked, it is destroyed. The upright can do great things, and they don't have to do like literal great things. Like, they don't have to be like the mayor of the city, right? They just have to be upright, and so they have to follow the laws. They have to believe in truth and justice. They have to fight for what is right. They have to speak in a way that is good. That's what matters, and that's what lifts an entire city. All right, so moving down to verse 20. The Lord detests those whose hearts are perverse, but delights in those whose ways are blameless. And I've mentioned this before. I just want to be careful that we say we don't misunderstand that the Lord um, is kind and loving and good and offers us forgiveness. But when it was one consistently turns away from Him and they follow a crooked path or perverse, which is away from the Lord, He hates that. And so He has given you Himself. He has made Himself really obvious. Again, He's screaming from the rooftops. He has wisdom screaming and shouting at you. And when you choose to turn away, He hates it. Verse 22, I just want to hit on. It says, like a gold ring in a pig's snout, it is a beautiful, like a gold ring in a pig's snout is a beautiful woman who shows no discretion. And I want to just note that what I gathered from this is that, because I was thinking, like, it's gross, yes, but what does it matter? It's a waste, right? Putting a gold ring in a pig's snout, I'm pretty sure, is a complete waste. It's a pig. And so why would you put a gold ring in a pig's snout? You're dressing up a pig, right? And so it's saying that a woman that shows no discretion is much the same way. Like it's a waste. It's very important for us as women to show discretion, to be discreet in what we do, to be wise, to make good choices. And so I call out to women to do this, and I know that women have been hurt for all through time, right? We are the weaker of the sexes, and physically, of course, is very literal, and so it's hard not to want to lift yourself up by yourself, but we need discretion, and we need to be smart and wise in our choices and the way in which we present ourselves. Verse 25, a generous person will prosper. Whoever refreshes others will be refreshed. And I just made me think of when Solomon gives to Queen of Sheba. So Queen of Sheba comes into town, and this was, I don't know, maybe a week ago. Queen of Sheba comes into town, and she tests Solomon on all these things. And then she comes bearing huge amounts of gifts, which is great, right? She's not a believer, and that's awesome that she thinks he's so wise. She comes and bears amazing amounts of gifts. He actually gives her more. And so he is abundantly generous, even though she came to him to give gifts. He gives her more and abundantly more, and then sends her back with more. And so that is, he continues to prosper, and we see how much he prospers. And I know he's the richest guy, and I know that, the kingdom is giving to him. But I think it's just a good note to see how generous he is. He's not one that holds back from his kingdom. It doesn't say he overtaxes or or he holds anyone down financially as a king. And he is abundantly wealthy. So the kingdom has wealth, and he has wealth because of the way in which he gives. Verse 28 goes back to verse 4. So verse 4 was, wealth is worthless in the day of wrath, but righteousness delivers from death. And verse 28, it says, those who trust in their riches will fall, but the righteous will thrive like a green leaf. And I say they're connected. I'm connecting them because there's not there later I'm going to come upon a verse that talks about how it's important to kind of make and have money, but this is trusting in your money, believing that your money is the most important thing, not having the ability to separate from your money because you're trusting in your money. And if you trust in those riches, if that's the thing that keeps you, or if that's the thing that you feel like you need in order to keep you, in order to have a good life, then you're going to fall. Righteousness is more important than wealth. Moving into verse 12, or chapter 12, verse 1, it says, whoever loves discipline loves knowledge, but whoever hates correction is stupid. And this, I really want to go back to our youth, because obviously those are the ones who are getting the most amounts of discipline right now, because they're young, and so they get discipline from sort of every single person they come into contact with, right? Like we're a little bit different. Maybe some people older than us say some things, maybe our bosses, right? Things like that. But for the most part, we're not getting as much discipline as the people growing up are. This is something that they should desire. They don't desire it because I don't know. Most of us don't desire it. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't give it, because it's good for them. To teach them to obey and follow the rules is really good for them. It's good for the youth. They are probably going to push against it because their brains aren't developed. So they're going to push against discipline, but it is good for them and it's going to develop them into a really good and loving adult. And so I urge all of us as adults, when we see things that are out of whack, to be open with our discipline amongst the youth, especially again, of course, in church. I'm going to say, especially among believers. This is something, if you're working in a youth group or if you're working in a youth ministry, like to keep kids on task and to keep teaching and to keep offering wisdom to them, to keep offering them discipline. Verse 5, it says, the plans of the righteous are just, but the advice of the wicked is deceitful. And so my biggest question myself is like, how do I know? How do I know the difference? You need to know who's righteous. You need to know who's around you and who's righteous, because when you set your mind on wisdom, you're going to notice around you who has wisdom and who doesn't. And so someone who's righteous, setting up plans, those are kind of the ones that you want to follow and listen to. No, not advice of the wicked. All right, verse 11, it says, those who work their land will have abundant food, but those who chase fantasies will have no sense. This one, I think, goes back to, again, the wealth ones, right? Like, no one is saying that you shouldn't want to work or acquire finances. We need those things to live. And so there's a fine line between working diligently, right? And if they work and they're going to have abundant food if they work their land. If they're off running about doing who knows what and just living in the moment, YOLO is definitely the expression of our generation, right? It's you only live once, which means like it's way better just like I'm going to work to make money, and I'm going to work to make money, but it's really only so I can go out and have a really good time. We've got to be careful of that. There's production in work and a sense of contentment. And there's something a little bit further that I feel like is going to go back to that. But when I get to it, I'll let you know. 17, an honest witness tells the truth. A false witness tells lies. It seems obvious. This goes back to way back in Exodus, where he talks about not bearing false witness, right? So not lying. An honest witness tells the truth. Are you an honest witness or are you a false witness, right? I know sometimes we don't like to tell the truth. And I'm not saying truth that's going to hurt people, but it's important to be honest as much as possible. I'm going to say when you can, but mostly you can. So it is important to be honest, not in the idea of trying to hurt someone, but in the idea of trying to help someone. So it should always be a loving reason why you're honest. Verse 18, the words of the reckless pierce like swords, but the tongue of the wise brings healing. So here we go with honesty again. Don't be reckless with your words. Like, don't be rude. Do I look fat? Yes, it's disgusting. Don't do that. That's completely unkind, unnecessary. And there are other ways that stuff like that can be handled. So don't be reckless with your words. Be wise. That will bring healing. There are other ways you can handle that situation. It's just a matter of you taking your time, sitting and not being prideful, sitting in your heart, being humble, recognizing what it is that they're genuinely asking you, and then responding to that in a truthful way. This takes a lot of work. These things take, like, as just I'm thinking about, like, kind of connecting all these pieces together. Being a person that's wise and loving in the way that God wants us to be, it takes time, it takes diligence, it takes patience, right? It takes kindness, it takes humility. All of these things kind of come together in order to be that person. And we don't do it well all the time, but are you striving to do it? Or are you just kicking back and being like, well, that's not my personality? If you are a follower of the Lord, I don't care what your personality is. This is what he's asking you to do. And I got to work on these things. I'm not coming to you, and I want to be very, very clear. I'm not coming to you as somebody that does all this stuff well. As I sit here and I read this, these things are shouting out to me because I'm like, man, am I honest enough? And I'm going to say more often than not, I'm not, because I try to people please. And so sometimes my honesty is lacking. I'm like white lying it, right? Because I'm like, I don't want to hurt their feelings, or I don't want to damage that, or I want to make sure that they like me. So I do all of these things too. And so sometimes I lack honesty because of those things. And that's not right either. Sometimes I let my pride get way ahead of me. And I forget to be humble and to treat another person better, or at least as well as I treat myself. Verse 25, it says, anxiety weighs down the heart, but a kind word cheers it up. when you are anxious, can you think of kind words? This is one of those things that we teach as a worldly whatever outside in the world. What do you say to yourself? And this isn't necessarily talking about yourself, but I know we have an abundance of anxiety right now. Like anxiety in our country is hugely on the rise. What are you saying to yourself? Are you saying to yourself, just until the next paycheck, or I didn't do that well enough, or right? Like, what are the things that you're repeating yourself, or are you repeating, the Lord is enough. I am comfortable with the way that I look. Right? I am made this way. I am glorious this way. The Lord loves me this way. Right? So what are you repeating to yourself? Are you repeating kind words or words that are going to continue to cause anxiety? And in that same way, once you say them to yourselves, are you doing this to other people as well when you see anxiety rearing up? Chapter 13, last one, verse 1. A wise son heeds his father's instruction, but a mocker doesn't respond to rebukes. Be a wise son. Do not be a mocker, right? So sit and listen to instruction, even when it doesn't feel right. I have a relationship with a person, and he gives me instruction sometimes, right? He's older than me. He's lived more life than me, and more often than not, I just kind of push back. And so sometimes I just have to listen to hear what he's actually saying, right? And too often I don't. I'm a little more chaotic in the way that, and I just want to jump the gun and I want to respond in some ways. And I have to sit back and listen, right? I need to listen to what he's saying or his instruction, right? To then know where it is that I need to go. All right, moving on to verse 4. A sluggard's appetite is never filled, but the desires of the diligent are fully satisfied. If you are lazy, you're just gonna want stuff all the time, and you're gonna deem that you deserve those things. Someone who works, the diligent, they tend to be more satisfied in their work, and if they're not, um, there's an idea that they should be, that when you're diligent and patient, there's satisfaction in your work. Verse 8, I wanted to hit on, and only in that. So verse 8 in my version is this: a person's riches may ransom their life, but the poor cannot respond to threatening rebukes. I had literally no idea what this meant. This was, I kept reading it over and over again. I kept trying to break it down, understand what it meant, because rebuke is what we're supposed to do when someone's kind of turning the wrong way. So I really didn't understand this. And so my recommendation is if this comes to you and you're in the same spot, what I did is I actually went to a different version. My version is the NIV, so it's the international version, right? So the New International Version. And so I just was having a struggle. So I went to the New Living Translation, which, if you've never seen it before, is an easier to read version, right? So they just kind of paraphrase things. They make it a little easier to read, where this is more word for word with the Hebrew. And it essentially says, if you are rich, so it's here it says, riches may ransom your life, but if you're poor, you're probably not going to need to be ransomed. So it cuts it a little bit differently than that. So go out and reach towards those first. Before you might reach to a commentary, go out and reach to a different version first. All right. Verse 10, where there is strife, there is pride. If you are fighting with someone, chances are good you're both being prideful. Wisdom is found in those who take advice. Verse 11, dishonest money dwindles away, but whoever gathers money little by little makes it grow. So this is another thing that I feel like goes back to the money and the finances stuff. Be patient in letting it grow little by little. You don't need everything at once. Again, this is one of the things that I think is definitely for the young. Because the young are sort of coming out of college and they're like, I'm in a huge amount of debt and I desperately need all this money. Be patient. Things will come. You don't need everything right away, right? So slow and steady, my dad always says, slow and steady wins the race, which is from The Tortoise and the Hare. Slow and steady wins the race. Have some patience. You don't need to jump ahead and try and get it in a bad way. You can just diligently, patiently get it nice and slow. And you'll see in the end, like my husband and I are coming to an area in our lives where our kids are adults and things just are a little bit smoother, right? We're not fighting to pay bills like we were when our kids were young and in diapers, and we had to pay for diapers and formula. And I'm not saying it's cheaper now. It's not necessarily, but we're older, and so we've accumulated a little bit more, and things are worth a little bit more. So, right. So it's just a matter of being patient. And when I was in the mix of it, and I wasn't even a believer then, but when I was in the mix of it and my children were young, I would have never seen this as my future. I was so stressed out all the time. So it's just a matter of, again, telling yourself before you're in these things, so when you're in these things, you can be reminded. Verse 20, walk with the wise and become wise, for a companion of a fool suffers harm. Be aware of who you spend time with. Are you spending time with people who love the Lord? Are you spending time with people who don't love the Lord? Are you spending time with people who are trying to pull you away from the Lord? Right? Or who are you spending time with? Are you spending time with people who are doing bad stuff all the time? Because bad stuff tends to breed more bad stuff. And then the last verse is verse 24. Whoever spares the rod hates their children. Whoever spares the rod hates their children. But one who loves their children is careful to discipline them. Do not misunderstand this and say you got to beat the crap out of your kids in order to love them. That's not what it's saying. The rod was used then as a disciplinary tool. We are in a day and age where it is not. It was used as a disciplinary tool. It wasn't used to abuse. It was used to bring children in line. And I know right now we're not in that place. And so you go, well, if that's in here and that's untrue, then everything's untrue. And obviously I want to steer clear from that we have to understand that this was a man of Israel 1,000 years before Christ was born, talking to men in Israel and talking about the way that they're rearing their children. Are you disciplining your child, or are you letting your child run amok? So we can use any disciplinary tool we discuss now in this generation, and it will go for the same thing. If you spare discipline, you are going to, what does it say? If whoever spares discipline hates their children. Your children need to be disciplined. They need to understand what it's like to be disciplined and grow up in the way of the Lord. That's where I'm ending. Didn't feel like it was on a good note, but it's fine. That's where I'm ending today. Tomorrow we're going to continue on with more Proverbs. It's going to be a lot of the same stuff. Hopefully I can go a little bit shorter, but it seems every day I'm running more than 30 minutes. So if you stuck with me, I want you to like this, share the channel, subscribe to it, and ring the bell so you get notifications every day. And then in the meantime, I want you to keep reading, and I will see you guys tomorrow.